Hi, everybody. You're about to get a treat. My son, Adam Trufant, is in Switzerland, and Father Gregory Pine is joining him to give us a teaching on St. Francis de Sales, one of my favorite saints. And in learning to see like the saints, oh, Jesus, let us all learn to see like Francis de Sales. Now, these two men led a camp counselor retreat to Switzerland, and they were studying St. Francis de Sales on this trip. But this interview that they were going to do for the Mission on the Mountain did not happen there. So I have had to coerce them with my best skill, and promise them jambalaya, chicken fricassee, anything they want if they could just get this done for me, and they did. So thank you, Adam. Thank you, Father Greg Pine. Y'all are wonderful human beings, and enjoy. We are so enjoying learning to see like the saints, and I hope you do too.
Okay.
No, we're crushing it. It's going so well.
Oh, yeah. Yes, sir. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. And this, episode of the Mission on the Mountains, Seeing with the Saints. My name is Adam Trufant, and we're here talking with Father Gregory Pine about St. Francis de Sales. We both share a love for St. Francis. I'm here in Switzerland right now with a view over my shoulder that would be familiar to Francis, who was the bishop of this region of Geneva. And so it's really cool to be here on these grounds where he walked and visited his 400 or so odd parishes while we have this conversation. So it's a real gift. Father Pine, thank you for being on the call today.
My esteemed pleasure.
Absolutely. It's good to see you again. So how are you doing today? How are things going?
I'm feeling groovy. I've got some random thoughts. Ready? 1, I lived in Switzerland for 3 years, and I love that place. 2, St. Francis de Sales lived at about the same time as Shakespeare. I think that's at least interesting, if not mesmerizing. And 3, I think the introduction to the Devout Life is one of the better books of all time. Those are my thoughts.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to talking about that. I know that you did some work on that book. You did a recording with Ascension, and they also published a new version in which you wrote the foreword. Am I correct in saying all those things?
That is correct. Not only the 4, I think, so Introduction to the Devout Life is divided up into 5 parts, and a confrere and I wrote little introductions to the book and then to those 5 parts. Not very long. I don't know that it merits like purchasing that particular volume. If folks already have access to a one that's less expensive, don't let the folks at Ascension hear me say that. But the retranslation of the text by Matthew Minard is actually pretty darn good. And he brought back out a couple of parts that had been suppressed in like a lot of Anglican translations in the 18th and 19th century, because Francis de Sales hits hard sometimes. And people will be like, whoa, that's, we're just going to edit that out. So he's like, bruh, you don't edit St. Francis de Sales, you send it. And so that's kind of cool.
Awesome. Well, I actually would recommend that volume because on a recent trip that we ran, I looked at a lot of different, translations of the book, and it's hard to find a good one. There's only a few that I feel really confident in. And it's a real shame to get a bad translation of Francis de Sales because he writes so beautifully. Well, I would just ask this. Had you read the book before you'd done that work with Ascension? And did you have a part in choosing that work? What was your experience with Francis de Sales before you did that explanation of the text with Ascension?
Yeah, so I've always struggled a little bit with spiritual reading because some spiritual authors, it's just very intense, and then you're like, I'm going to do this thing which he or she suggests, and then you try it for like 3 days, and then all of a sudden you're like, like curled up in a ball on the floor of your bathroom. You're like, I maybe am not that holy. So the thing that I love about St. Francis de Sales is that he's so mild, like he's so gentle, not in that he babies you or he says like, oh, you can get around to the work of conversion later. No, he's serious about conversion, but he's got this really sweet style. He was addressing the work to the Madame Marie de Chamoisy, who was kind of high society, a little bit of an aristocrat. And he was trying to make it such that the gospel made sense within the setting of her life. Obviously, there are going to be things that need to change, maybe some things that can undergo less of a revolution, but, So my sister Kristen really loved it. I'd read it once before I entered the order. And then I think I read it once in the order. And then when Ascension asked, I read it like 3 or 4 times in preparation for the podcast that we had recorded. So it's the type of thing to which you can always return with profit because it just treats, kind of building blocks. Just bread and butter Christian things.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think a lot of people probably find it refreshing to hear you say that you struggle with spiritual reading because, you're a religious. And I think that's probably a very common feeling. It's like, wow, these people obviously fit into this particular approach to ascent and spirituality, and I feel subpar when I try. So,
Yeah.
but everybody has their own way to God, in the words of Pope Benedict. So, okay, awesome. So, maybe tell us a little bit about Saint Francis and what made his distinctive holiness arise. He's also a doctor of the Church. Maybe if you feel moved, you could comment on some of those things.
Yeah. So St. Francis de Sales lived at the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century. As people know, the city of Geneva was a Calvinist city. So the reformer John Calvin, in French, Jean Calvin, was installed there in Geneva. And so the kind of Swiss arrangement was that each canton or each state had its religion, and that those of another religion typically would flee in search of a more secure setting in which to worship, in which to live. So Geneva was a kind of Calvinist stronghold, and St. Francis de Sales, he ran his diocese from a short distance. He was mostly in the city of Annecy, Annecy, France, which is in the region of Savoie or Haute-Savoie. He himself was a Savoyard. And so we know him for any number of things, but his writings are especially precious. People who know the Visitation Sisters or the Visitation Nuns will probably be familiar with St. Francis de Sales because he founded with St. Jane Frances de Chantal the first Visitation convents. And then there have also been like a lot of movements in the years since his death, which are inspired by his spirituality, perhaps the most famous of which are the Salesians of St. John Bosco. So he himself was a very charismatic leader, St. John Bosco, but he reached back and availed himself of the spirituality of St. Francis de Sales in his service of the youth in his evangelical efforts. So yeah, I don't know, anything else that you are interested in or anything else that you yourself love about him?
Yeah, well, actually, you touched on something that I kind of wanted to bring up, which I'd reflected on because my family recently went to Turin. My son's name is Bosco. I love Bosco. And I wanted to talk about the influence of saints on other saints.
Mm.
I'm aware, of Philip Neri's. He at least had a bit of a remote, it's maybe a somewhat distant influence on Francis de Sales. But Francis de Sales studied in Milan, I think, while Philip Neri, who was this Counter-Reformation giant in Rome, the saint of the joyful heart, who had a huge impact just through his joy on the church that was kind of burning down, trying to figure itself out again. And Francis de Sales adopted some of Philip Neri's, I guess, approaches with young people. If I remember correctly, he adopted the oratory and sort of relocated it in some of his ministry areas in the diocese that he worked with. And then, of course, John Bosco saw Francis de Sales as like sort of a grandfather or a mentor. And right after he was ordained a priest, he made a private vow that he wrote down, saying, for the rest of my life, I'm gonna dedicate myself to the example of Francis de Sales, and in such a self-effacing way that, like you said, he founded his order after it. And I just think it's beautiful. Like, I think John Bosco, I feel, is like kind of like a dad. And then I think Francis de Sales is kind of like a grandfather. And then I think Philip Neri is kind of like my great grandfather spiritually. And I just think it's beautiful to think about, even if they weren't friends in person, there's sort of a friendship in the spirit. And I feel that influence in my life. And I wondered if you had any thoughts or comments on saints that impacted you, or how saints can encourage each other in the faith in this way.
Yeah. I think about it in terms of like friendship. Here on the surface of the earth, each of us have a couple of very close friends, and then maybe another handful of close friends, and then maybe another handful of friends, and then maybe another kind of circle of acquaintances. But you realize there are only so many people in this world with whom you can share practically your whole life. And I think that devotion with saints works in a somewhat similar fashion, in the sense that, like, you can pray litanies or you can pray novenas of various sorts, but there's probably like one or two or three saints to whom you're inclined, or whose company you keep. So for me, it's Saint Dominic, and then Saint Thomas Aquinas are my go-tos. Obviously, everyone has the Blessed Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph in their kind of suite of best friends, because you can't but. But yeah, Saint Thomas Aquinas and Saint Dominic are two to whom I appeal basically every day. And I think about it in terms of this: like, when you're close friends with somebody, you pick up those person's traits, characteristics, verbal tics, formulations, whatever. Like, you become a lot like that person. You even prefer the things that they prefer to a certain extent. And I think that you can talk about it in terms of, like, that person kind of gets into your eye. That person becomes, in a certain sense, part of your personality. And that's just been my experience with the saints, is that when you profit from their readings and you address them, for veneration, you beseech their intercession, when you get bound up with their life, that you hope to become like them. Not just in the sense of, like, I'm going to use this person to get holy, but in the sense that I like this person's company. And so I'd like to keep it for all eternity, because the way that they introduce me to the Lord, or the way that they pull things out of Christian life and present them for better understanding and better imitation, is just awesome. So I think that's a great point.
Cool. Yeah, I think I've heard you speak on friendship in several different places. I think you have a really beautiful take on it. I just want to point that out, because it's a hard thing to pin down, and I've noticed that in several of your talks, you take great pains to show how necessary it is. And so I was excited to hear your reflection on that, because I think it's really special. And I think a lot of us, especially when we choose confirmation saints, or as we navigate daily life, we don't necessarily think about all of heaven being ready to assist us. So yeah, it's beautiful to hear your take on that. Okay, so for today in 2026, in the dawn of AI, all of these things that are now pressing on us, all the politics and the pressures we're experiencing. If Francis were here today, now knowing what a deep reading you've done of his work, what do you think would be a fundamental encouragement that he would impress upon us?
Yeah, I'd say that the whole point of the first book of the Introduction to the Devout Life is just kind of formulating your intention to live a devout life. I think one of the first things he'd say is, you can trust your desire. Specifically, you can trust your desire for holiness. The Lord has sown it in your heart. He intends for that seed to germinate and for it to grow and to blossom and to bear fruit. And obviously, you're going to encounter a lot of different obstacles, or like difficulties, throughout the course of your life, but don't let them depress you. Don't let them deter you. Just continue to entrust that desire to the Lord, confident that he'll bring about its fulfillment. And then in the remaining books, he'll talk especially about prayer, sacraments. He'll talk about virtues and vices. He'll talk about, various other things that feature into our Christian lives. But I think he'd just continually direct our attention back to the building blocks, and prayer and sacrament being the most fundamental. Obviously, you can introduce some penance into your life and study the faith. And obviously, I think about friendship as the real setting in which Christian life becomes real, takes flesh. But prayer and sacrament. So he'd probably tell you something like, listen, you don't have to worry about all these things, because you're not responsible for taking them on board. Your ship's little, and it's at risk of getting swamped. All of us are, just overwhelmed by the complexity of life, and that's nothing to be embarrassed about. But just pray, and then make good use of the sacraments. So pray each day for 15, 20 minutes. Make sure you're at Mass on Sundays and holy days, but you can bop in with greater frequency. And when it comes to the sacrament of confession, it's not just a reset button; it's a source of grace. So avail yourself of it. You might go every month. That'd be a great way in which to live your baptismal consecration, your confirmational consecration, with greater fullness. So I think that he'd say, trust the desires that God's sown in your heart, and then take the little steps that God has kind of appointed along your path, and you can be confident that he who has begun a good work in you will see it to completion.
Fantastic. That sounds like a great place to wrap up. Man, thank you so much in taking the time to share on this little opportunity to look through the eyes of St. Francis de Sales. And it's a joy to talk to you here from Switzerland, and a place where I know you've shared a whole lot of wonderful moments, and also, celebrated Mass in the presence of his relics. So God bless you, man. Thank you for your time, and have a beautiful day.
Hey, you too. Hug the mountains for me.
I will. A big fat hug. All right, now how do I turn off this recording?
You got this. I believe in you.
I believe I can figure it out. Dude, thanks so much.
You're crushing it, bro. Absolutely crushing it.
This is gonna merit Jim.